This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute of International and European Affairs. A very warm welcome. It's not that often we get to say good morning at an event, because so often we're doing our stuff in the afternoon, so it's very pleasant. We're here to discuss and reflect on the future of Europe's social model and the Irish presidency, with a really excellent panel that I'm going to present in a moment. But I'm going to say two or three things first. It really feels kind of maybe last week, this week, the Irish presidency of the Council of the EU has started, just with the amount of delegations and visits and focus that is going to be in Ireland for this relatively short period. And I'd grown to become really enthusiastic of the presidency, but also maybe a little bit cynical, thinking that it's a 6-month period, everyone gets to go, what can you possibly achieve in such a short period of time? So not to denigrate it, I was trying to be kind of realist about it, I suppose. But we've just come off the back of a, good morning, Kevin. Good to have you in. I was wondering where you were. But there is a sense that the Irish presidency, I think, to quote Commissioner Marta Costa, and I'm going to keep quoting this because she spoke with us last Friday, and she was saying she's very hopeful for the Irish presidency because the Irish will bring some fresh air, some energy, and some humour to the discussion, all of which are actually really vital kind of ingredients to good policy making and, you know, the effective resolution of problems. And I'm now just extra energised by the presidency. And this discussion is an attempt to try to, ahead of the presidency, reflect on the current state of Europe's social dimension and to identify the main gaps and opportunities in European social policy, legislation and making that there might be. And I'll hand over to the panel after making two further brief remarks. That Ireland, we know, has been transformed over the past 50 years by various things, factors and influences, but primary amongst them is Ireland's membership of the then EEC from 1973, the European Union, the European project, whatever you want to call it, both in terms of inward investment, in terms of the arrival of new ideas, ways of doing things, the removal of the marriage ban in the civil service, the kind of just promotion of good, ethical, dignified employment. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. The European project has been responsible for the introduction of some of the most enlightened and positive and progressive rules and laws that we have. And the final point I'll make is we have custody of this place, this institute that's been around since the early 90s. And I do know that social policy formed a really important part of the institute's early work in its opening decades. And it's something that we've never neglected, but we never do enough of. So I'm really pleased to emphasize that this is a partnership with our colleagues at Task. I'm very happy that Shana Cohen is on the panel and we work increasingly closely. You know, Dublin's a small town. There's not that many think tanks. We should be falling over each other a lot more than we are. So I'm very pleased that this is the first of hopefully much further, closer engagement over the months and years ahead. So the panel we have, absolutely delighted. No stranger to the Institute, no stranger to an Irish audience. We have Esther Lynch, who's General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. Esther's going to go first in a little while, take to the podium and give us an abbreviated keynote address of kind of 7 or 8 minutes. Hello, Mary McCaughey. We're also, as I said, delighted to be joined after Esther. We hear from Dr. Shana Cohen, Executive Director at the Think Tank for Action and Social Change, Task. We're very pleased that Dr. Marie Epson, the Deputy Director of Eurofound, is going to join us. Just to embarrass you, Maria, my postgraduate studies, my master's, my PhD focused on the European Trade Union Confederation, then in European Industrial Relations. And without your work and your kind of seminal 2006 book, I believe, on the European social model, I wouldn't have been able to pass my thesis. And indeed, the work that yourself and others have done at ETY, the European Trade Union Institute, absolutely seminal and really important, along with your ongoing work at Eurofound. So you're a vessel for a huge amount of ideas that are very personally relevant to me, but also relevant to this discussion. So thanks for being with us. And then also thrilled that Nicola Harkin, Head of Employment Law Services at IBEC, is joining us. Thanks a million, Nicola. You also just reminded me on the way up the stairs that you're on the Social Affairs Committee at Business Europe. So a very appropriate person to be representing the IBEC, the Employer Federation, here at this discussion this morning. So we're joined by you guys here in person. Also those joining online, you're very welcome. This discussion is on the record. You can participate when we get to the Q&A by either raising your hands if you're here or signaling in some way, and a microphone will come to you. Or indeed, those online, you're welcome to participate through the Q&A function on Zoom. That's enough for me, unless I'm forgetting any essential health and safety warning. someone should remind me about. We're good to go. Esther, if you take to the mic, and if you can welcome Esther in the traditional way. Thank you, Esther.
What a great way to start a Monday morning, the working week. I'm really happy to be here in Dublin and very grateful for the invitation from Barry and the IIEA, and to talk about the social model and the Irish presidency. And before I get into the nuts and bolts of what I've come to talk about, which is jobs, pay and conditions, really want to congratulate the Irish presidency on putting into the programme, and I think it's the first presidency to do so, to put into the programme the accession of the EU to the European Convention on Human Rights. Ireland has a great tradition of human rights. We go all the way back to Roger Casement, but also Edward Phelan at the ILO. We have a great tradition of developing, understanding and enforcing human rights. So I really congratulate the Irish presidency in doing that, and given everything, the geopolitical situation that we're in at the moment, the attacks coming from America, I think that making sure that the EU itself and all of the institutions of the EU respect the European Convention on Human Rights. And just to say, the Irish presidency can rely fully on the ETUC for every support to advance that discussion. But working people, when they ask the General Secretary to come and speak on their behalf, they want us to talk about jobs, they want us to talk about pay, and they want to talk about the conditions that they're working under, because that's what really matters to them. And for working people, the European Union was built on a very clear promise. It wasn't just about open markets. It wasn't just about the ability of capital to move freely. It was about saying to every person working in the EU, you're not on your own, that we have systems that will support and work for you. Your children will do better than you did. And that was the promise, that was the contract. But right now, we see it's under serious strain. I see it in my own life, and I know all of you will be seeing it in your life too. We see young people skipping meals, reporting record low levels of mental health well-being, locked into precarious work and with no security on the horizon, fearful about the future, and often fearful every day of the consequence of making a mistake at work. And we know the reality here in Ireland is that so many people can't afford to leave home, can't afford to have a family. Across Europe, minimum wage you all think it's Dublin. It's not Dublin that's the worst. There's worse capitals than Dublin for being able to afford a one-bedroom apartment. In 3 capitals, you have to have 3 full-time minimum wage jobs to be able to afford a one-bedroom home. Then we also see at the other end of the gender of the its perspective is older workers promised a just transition, promised that they'll be supported. Everybody said we'll leave no one behind. I don't know any politician who's taken a speech to talk about the just transition who hasn't said we'll leave no worker, no community behind. But we see throughout Europe that many of the jobs that are lost, workers are not managing to find replacement work. And that isn't a personal misfortune, it's an injustice in our systems. And it's contrary to what the European social model asked for. And workers are getting angry. And the reason they're getting angry is because they did everything that was asked of them. They worked, studied, they contribute, held up their end from COVID to every other crisis. They've done everything that was asked of them. So the question now for the Irish presidency is how to lead a discussion with the rest of the European Union to make sure that there's a solidaristic response across all member states to that challenge. And I want to be clear that I really, really support the European Union being able to do this. And I think that the Irish presidency can for sure lead on this. We've lots of examples in the past of how the European Union stands up for working people. Equal pay for work of equal value, protection from discrimination, health and safety standards, parental rights, maternity rights, minimum wage protections, and now the right to unionize and recognition of the right to collective bargaining. These are not small administrative details, they're real achievements. They have been won through decades of struggle, they're not red tape, they are rights that workers rely on. But what we know is that contracts, and especially social contracts, can be rewritten. And that's precisely what some are attempting to do. 3 weeks ago, when I heard Taoiseach Micheál Martin in Paris, and he spoke about his agenda for the Irish presidency, he said competitiveness, the Capital Markets Union, and the 28th Company regime. And I think that for working people, we were very worried. The reason we were worried is because the 28th Company regime is also promoted by Commissioner McGrath. And for us, the 28th Company regime, and I see a lot of people here who will remember the Bolkestein Directive. Now, the 28th Company regime is like Bolkestein Directive 2.0. It's the same proposal, dressed up a little bit different way with a somewhat different logic. It's a plan that will result in social dumping. I do not think that that is Commissioner McGrath's intention. I want to be clear about that. But I think it's the consequence of the proposal he's put forward. It will be an escape hatch so that employers will be able to have a seat in one member state and apply the rules from that member state when it comes to employment rights, when it comes to avoiding collective agreements. They will be able to have a whole new form of bogus self-employment based on share options, and to replace the right to minimum wage with the promise of shares in the future. They'll be able to set up within 48 hours at the big cost of €100. We all know in the construction sector what kind of abuses that will bring about. If you can open and close a company, workers will never be able to chase their employer into a courtroom to get their wages. But not just the construction sector, we see it in agriculture and also in transport. So there's lots of problems associated with the proposal that should have been fixed before it was launched. The type of protections necessary should have been put in place. They should have guaranteed that everything I've said cannot possibly happen. But none of those protections, not one single article gives a right to a Labour inspectorate to ask for information. Not one single article says that the employer has to establish, as they currently do, if they're employing somebody in a member state. So for us, we're very clear that the 28th Company regime isn't progress, it is regression, dressed up in some kind of like language about good for startups. So we really are calling for the Irish presidency to put right everything that's wrong in that proposal, to put in place the necessary safeguards so that those companies that do want to start up can do so, but they can do so in a manner that fully respects all of the national employment rights that are available in each and every member state. And they're different in each and every member state, just like collective agreements are different. We need to not have a 28th Company regime that damages collective agreements, board-level participation rights, or any of our hard-fought-for national rights and entitlements. The focus, of course, is on competitiveness, and myself and Barry had a conversation about this because competitiveness could be a good thing, but you wouldn't then talk about competitiveness. What you talk about is growth. What you talk about is investment. What you talk about is jobs, and what you talk about is public services, and what you talk about is industrial policy. You wouldn't just say competitiveness, because competitiveness is such a small part of an ingredient. It's not the full. It's not everything that you need. For us at a European level, words like really matter, and the choice of a particular word and the absence of those other words says something, because competitiveness on its own, without qualification, without context, is not an economic program. It's a direction of travel in which those voices who are calling for lower standards, reducing costs, that those voices are the ones that the presidency is in danger of saying that it's listening to. So what we're asking for is not a one-sided presidency, but for a presidency that balances the interests of working people and of industries. And we think that Ireland can do that. I don't think that is impossible for Ireland. I think that Ireland can do that. But Ireland needs to start talking about making the pie bigger and making the share of that pie fairer for everybody. It needs to be clearer about an industrial strategy across Europe, across regions in different sectors. And it needs to be clear in how working people will benefit from that. And that means also discussing public services, healthcare, education, training, childcare, transport, energy, and housing. Because that building that economic infrastructure is how we get real sustainable growth across Europe. Then before I get to the more positive agenda, I want to raise another concern and to really ask the Irish presidency to change course, and that's on the equal pay agenda. We struggled over the last couple of years in the European Pillar of Social Rights, a response to the damage caused during the Troika years to reinforce that working people can believe in the European Union again, like a new social contract established through the European Pillar of Social Rights. One of those rights was equal pay for work of equal value. And the Pay Transparency Directive implemented a lot of that promise. The deadline for its transposition is the 7th of June. And working women around Europe are very, very concerned and frustrated that what has happened is almost like a massive game of chicken, where the employers are saying we're not going to implement it, and they hope that the member states will then say, well, we won't transpose it, and then they hope that the Commission won't take the necessary infringement proceedings against them. But women in Europe, we've waited long enough. The commitment to equal pay is in the founding treaty. So it's just not possible for us to accept a backward step on the Pay Transparency Directive. And I particularly want to thank President von der Leyen, because she doesn't get anywhere near she hardly ever gets a thanks for anything. And she does a lot that's wrong, and I'm the first person to call her out on that, so I need to be the first person when she does something right. She's given a very firm commitment to back that directive, and Ireland must back up that when we pass a law, employers must respect that law, and member states must also do the necessary to ensure that they do. So equal pay, it's the transparency just makes it clear whether or not you're paying people equal pay, and anybody who's scared of doing that, well then fix your equal pay system. Don't refuse to make it transparent. Then the most positive part of the agenda that we're looking forward to, and really this is how I finish, Barry, is to say we really hope that the Irish presidency backs our quality jobs agenda, because we need to answer this question for young people, which is how can we turn things around so that my future is at least as good as my parents, and it doesn't look more like my grandparents. And so that means that we have to tackle the quality job deficits, whether it is burnout and stress caused by ethical stress. Take an example of a teacher, take an example of a nurse, go to work every day. The size of the classroom means they can't spend the time with the struggling students. The nurse can't spend the time with the patient who's scared. They feel bad about the job that they did, because that's not what they trained to do. That's not what they turn up every day to do. But the conditions that they work under make it almost impossible for them to do the job that they want to do. And they feel bad about themselves, personally. And then they go home every day, and then they know tomorrow it's going to be the exact same, and the exact same, and the exact same, and the exact same every day. And I think that is driving a lot of the burnout. There's also then the other, which is, and I have to say, now, I don't know what's gone on in all our business colleges, but I see more and more the use of fear as a tool of management. That working people are scared of the consequence of making a mistake. And all of these measurements, how happy was your service? All of that. And if you get too many unhappies, you'll be the person on the list to be let go. You won't get the promotion. You won't advance. And all of this, over-management, mismanagement, using fear as management, is creating it's not my research saying this, it's research throughout Europe is saying that the level of stress and burnout among young people in particular is now reached too high a level. So we need to treat psychosocial risks the same as any other health and safety risk. And this Quality Jobs Act could make sure to enshrine that within that act, to make it very clear that employers need to sit down with the workforce, with trade unions, and say, how do we measure the impact of the way in which we're organising work, of the management of people? How do we do that in a manner that meets all of the legitimate demands, but does not create burnout and stress? And then we also have the oldest forms of exploitation still happening in Europe. About 10 days ago, 4 workers, I don't know if it reached Ireland, but 4 workers were set on fire inside a minivan by gangmasters because they were agriculture workers who hadn't been paid for a month, and they started to talk to the other thousands of agriculture workers they were working with. And then as response, they were killed. So that gangmaster system is still operating in Europe. And we do not have the tools, we do not have the labour inspectors, we don't have the right regime in place. So we can't, throughout Europe, believe that we don't have to look at increasing enforcement of the rights, entitlements and protections of people. So that needs to be part of the Quality Jobs Act. The other part that needs to be part of the Quality Jobs Act is to look at how artificial intelligence is being used in the employment relationship. That does not mean that artificial intelligence is held back. What it means is that you need safeguards in the context of the employment relationship. It needs to understand and recognize the power imbalance and the way in which workers can be vulnerable to inappropriate monitoring, measurement, and management by AI. And how by putting in place a process that says that workers and their trade unions must be involved in the rollout use of AI. This shouldn't be controversial. It's part of our well-established European social model, and it's the most effective way to guarantee that AI is used in a manner which doesn't undermine human dignity, as was raised by His Holiness Pope Leo recently. In summary, there's every possibility for the Irish presidency to do exactly this thing that Ireland does so well, which is to be the bridge between, we say, America and Europe, which is to have a vibrant society looking forward and progressive, where we don't take any steps back on respect for people at work, regardless of who they love or where they're from. There's no need to take any steps backwards on that to be successful. There's no need to take any steps back on employment rights, on equal pay to be successful. Instead, what we need to do is to have a two-sided presidency, not one that only talks about competitiveness, but one that talks about growth, based on investment, based on quality jobs, based on a European preference, based on supporting every company that has in place a European social model of involving trade unions, of looking to make sure that working people succeed, that they have an opportunity for investment in themselves so that they can succeed in the future, and that we make sure that our social security systems have in place just transition payments that last between the time when you lose your job until the time where you get the next one, because that's the only way that we can guarantee people that if they lose the lifeline of their job, that they're not left with no other lifeline, but there's a safety net in place until they get the next job, and that we start treating the necessity of building that bridge for working people in a manner which isn't just the right intentions, but is also the right policies. So I'm optimistic about the Irish presidency. And I think, as I said, that Ireland has proved we can do all of this and proved that we can be successful. So I think that we need to look towards that approach rather than taking a one-sided competitiveness only drive. Thank you, Barry.
Million. Thank you so much. I'll invite you in a second, Shayna, but just to say that was such a phenomenal place to start. It's always so good to hear you, Esther, but it's also so sobering to hear you. But what I really appreciate is there are some very kind of specific things there for us to think about and for the Irish Presidency to think about around the convention, the 28th regime and the necessary safeguards, the Equal Pay Agenda, the Quality Jobs Act, and so much more that you mentioned. But I'll just reference briefly the conversation we'd had about competitiveness, because it is something intellectually I've become very interested in this idea. There's an increasing broadening of how we're defining competitiveness, or how some are defining competitiveness, to take in matters of a healthy society as a competitive society, a cohesive and prosperous and peaceful society is a competitive society. But as a social scientist, I'm equally kind of motivated and concerned by definitions and meanings. And I think you're dead right, because that's and you're dead right in what you say, that we're talking about growth and industrial policy there, actually. So I think over the course of the panel, we may go further into that, like what actually we're talking about when we're talking about competitiveness. So really brilliant place to start, and thank you. Now, Shane, I said from the outset, you're very welcome, guys, to either speak from the seat or speak from the podium. Do you have a preference? Fantastic. And Maria, Nicola, I won't remind you of the health warning. You can either speak from where you are or from up here. Shayna, please.
So that was fantastic. Thank you. For those of you who don't know TASK, we focus on inequality and democracy in Ireland and the EU. So my remarks will reflect that position. And I'm also American, as you can tell from the accent. So I would come at this from an American perspective. And when I was preparing for this today, there were a couple things I was thinking about. One was the omnibus legislation, which is an appropriation of what Trump is doing to try to shove through a lot of bills or his agenda. And then the second thing was his agenda, which was crafted by the Heritage Foundation, and that's Project 2025. And there's a lot of discussion among the Democrats about Project 2029. But to go back to the European Union, what I'm finding when you're talking about is there's a focus on legislation and the means of passing legislation, but there's no equivalent of Project 2029 or whatever we want to call it. So the third thing I was thinking about when I was looking at preparing, but looking at some of the legislation, is that when you talk about competitiveness, there's another agenda which talks about abundance or capability. There's a big abundance debate in the United States about state investment, which would come through some of the European funds. Let's say if you're going to talk about young people and housing, there's an enormous percentage of young people in Europe who have to, and I know because I have two right now, living at home because they can't afford student housing. And so the European Union has acknowledged that, and the problems that young people face because they have to live at home while they're going to university. So that's like invest the state or European Unions, the international institutions invest in the future of young people. And that's this kind of debate that's going on in the United States as well, that invest in innovation. But the other side of that is you've picked up, Esther, is deregulation. So let's say taking small, medium-sized enterprises out of climate restrictions, pushing it to like 1,000 employees or more in order to have to. So is that investing in the future? So deregulation is an American agenda point, but it's deliberately to roll back climate legislation and copying that. And I would hope that the Irish presidency would account for that. Copying that is not the answer. So the third thing that I was thinking about when I'm preparing for this is I was reading a paper by Henning Meyer for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, where he talks about state capability, and he's appropriating some of the arguments from the abundance discussion in the United States: invest, innovate, deregulate to the point of allowing infrastructure projects to go through. But he adds a dimension, and I'm saying this as a member of civil society, that you have to invest in communities and you have to invest in a narrative, which Project 2025 has done, but in a very narrow almost dystopian way in life chances at an individual level. So people living in the European Union need to think that the European Union is improving their life chances. At the same time, the European Union, which has rolled back some of its funding for gender equality organizations and civil society, and is becoming a lot more competitive even to get like the citizen engagement type grants, the European Union needs to think, we need a robust and resilient civil society. In Ireland, civil society, some organizations are completely on their knees because of funding restrictions, but also increasing pressure not to use funding for advocacy, just to be service providers for the state. That undercuts what civil society is about. And I'll end with this, which you missed, but I'll bring it up as a member of civil society, that Project 2025 is an explicit far-right agenda, and you can see its appropriation by far-right political movements and parties in Europe. Somebody, about a couple months ago, I was talking to him, and he sent me an article that said, close a pub, encourage somebody to join the far-right. So what's happening, and I noticed when I was looking through the European Social Fund has not like ignored this fact, because increasing in tasks work as a member of civil society, we've noticed repeatedly that there are no community spaces, or if there have been community spaces, they're closed down. So you can't have an agenda where you're promoting democracy, equal rights, everything that you've mentioned, without an infrastructure for encouraging people to participate in some form of social solidarity, particularly for young people. In our work, like in some of the most disadvantaged areas of Ireland, young people repeatedly say there's nothing to do. There's no place to go. There's no place to congregate. There's no place to be a human being and to feel some sense of dignity. So if the European Union is really serious about like competitiveness in its broad sense, then they have to invest in the organizations and in the institutions that actually enable that to happen at a very local level. And in that way, they'll build confidence in the European Union, and you won't be promoting this kind of Eurosceptic far-right agenda that we're seeing. It's so mobilized, and in some instances, very well funded. And I'll stop there.
And it's actually quickly, Shane, thank you very much. Excellent remarks. This pressure, the distinction you drew between civil society organizations providing service provision rather than advocacy, is that a newish direction of travel? Were things the same 5-10 years ago, or is this a new sort of pressure?
I think that the funding is drying up from a European level. There's far more competition for European funds for civil society organizations. So that's diminishing a source of funding that they could use. One, I'm speaking as somebody who does research, generate data to help civil society inform new projects, but also give them the space, because they can't get it with a government contract. You can't use government funding for advocacy. And there's a logic to that. But it gives them the space with some of the European Foundation funding to develop a strategy for advocating for the people that they represent. I think that's become more acute. And it isn't just advocacy like political lobbying. It's also just having the capacity to think, what are the needs of the people that we represent and what do they want out of life? It's not just treating people who use civil society services as users and people in need, but it's actually giving them a sense of agency and dignity and all the things that you want to do to create, like what you were saying, social cohesion, which makes us, an economy more competitive because you have more productive people who are more independent from benefits, et cetera, and who can see like, okay, I have a life strategy rather than just being pessimistic about the future.
We may come back to it as well, that this is about the European social model, but to mention the US again, I'm sure the retrenchment of USAID has had an impact on your peer organizations, especially the further east we go in Europe, civil society organizations in Central and Eastern Europe.
There've been a couple, like I think Open Society used to fund a lot of those organizations, and it's pulled back because of the situation in the US. There was the Rowan Trust here, which pulled out of Ireland because they wanted to focus on the anti-abortion issue in the US. So some of those, it's not just USAID, it's also some of the foundations that used to cross borders are now focusing explicitly in the United States.
Cool. Very clear. Thanks a million, Shana. Our friends in Lochnastown, Maria, would you like to go next?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to start maybe from a more abstract level, and that was kind of sparked from the text that was up on the website about this event today. Whether the European social model was rolling back. And as you said, I've done a lot of work, so it sparked a lot of thoughts. What we were talking about competitiveness before, I mean, let's go back to the Lisbon strategy. Lisbon strategy is, okay, it's a long time ago, but it's not that long time ago. And the Lisbon strategy actually said that it make Europe the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy focusing on growth, jobs, and social cohesion. That was the wording from the Lisbon strategy. And basically from the very outset, no, I wouldn't say from at least from the 70s, the European integration has always been accompanied by a very strong social component, whether it was put in simultaneously or it came as an afterthought or as a reaction to this deepening of the European integration. Think about the Single Act in '86. That's when we got all the occupational health and safety legislation that's fundamental for all member states in the European Union. We go to the introduction of the euro with the Maastricht. We got the European integration on the monetary union, but we also got a large enlargement in terms of scope where the European level could engage with social issues on a different level, not in terms of legislation, but more in terms of what we call soft law. So Europe has always been trying to kind of move forward with the European integration and with the various agendas, but always accompanied, mostly, I'd say mostly accompanied with a social dimension. And I think the last kind of social push impulse we got was the European Pillar of Social Rights in 2017. Now, it's not about rights, but it was about 20 principles that should be fundamental for the European society. And last year, we did a stock taking at Eurofound in terms of where we were with this idea of having upward social integration in the European Union based on the headline indicators for the European Pillar of Social Rights. And actually, we saw a somewhat positive picture. So I'm going to be a little bit the optimist here and say that, you know, we do have this common ambition, and several of you mentioned it. We have this common ambition of improving work and life for European citizens. The European citizens expect the European Union to actually push in that direction, not to push in the opposite direction. And when we look back to what we actually have been able to achieve from 2017 to today, well, last year, we have, and I'll talk in terms of upwards convergence. Upwards convergence simply means that the indicator is going in a positive direction and the laggards are catching up, okay? Because having a European Union that is not converging also creates tensions and makes it politically very difficult to move forward together, right? So this idea of having an upward convergence is an extremely important point in the European integration. And here, when we looked at this upward convergence with regard to the agenda on the European Pillar of Social Rights, we had various positive results, like the unemployment rates are up, unemployment was down, and meaning the countries that had the highest unemployment rates were actually decreasing their unemployment rates at a faster rate than the ones that had lower. So this is very positive in a sense. The NEETs rates are down. NEETs are the young people not in employment, training, or education. Income inequality was narrowing as well. And we were also making progress on long-term employment and early school leavers, and the gender employment gap and child poverty. But while we had these indicators fairly positive, mostly related, or actually all of them related to the labor market, on the other side, we had some pain points or points that give rise for concerns. And here, where we had the pain points that we have identified is we're not progressing as we wanted to progress on early childhood education and care. We were not progressing as we were expecting on digital skills, and we're not moving forward as we wanted on unmet medical needs. Now, some of these items are on the Irish presidency agenda. So they're picking up on some of the pain points that remain within the agenda on the European Pillar of Social Rights. Having said that, these averages, and we also should not recognize that over the past decades, we've actually created 30 million new jobs. Okay, so we've had a net addition of 30 million new jobs, most of them filled by women and older workers. Okay, so these are very positive move forwards. And when we look at the job quality on the averages, again, we can say for over the past 10, 15 years, we have actually worked on averages, it's been going in the right direction, right? So we've actually slightly increased the job quality since 2010 in the way that Eurofound defines it with 7 different dimensions. I won't go into it because I don't have time. I can go into it afterwards. However, once this positive said with some pain points that we need to tackle, once we start unpacking the averages, that's when we get into trouble, right? So this is when we get into saying, okay, but this progress is not progressing in the same manner for different groups in society. When we look at job quality, basically men has always had a slightly better job quality than women. This remains. But where we see really worrying trends for women, and here I join in what you were saying, is with regard to the trends in terms of the job quality on the more social interactions, where women, the job quality for women is decreasing. So we see that in the labor market, the way it's developed over the past 15 years, women are being more exposed to strenuous job conditions in terms of mostly client-facing jobs. And that is impacting on the overall job quality for women. When we look at the job quality on averages, we have a very good, a very good result, but it's not similar for the occupations and sectors across the European Union. And here again, we've got some of the sectors where we do have labor shortages, healthcare, transport, construction, and so forth, where we clearly see that the job quality is below the average for the European Union. So looking at the averages is very good, but we need to unpack and look at and really find out where are the pain points and how can we actually address these pain points. And I think some of the items that are on the Irish presidency agenda will be able to unpack and deal with some of these issues in that sense. Moving towards, and this would be my last point then, looking towards the future then in terms of the twin transition, so on the digital transition and on climate change. Here again, what technology has been impacting European workplaces for the past 20 years. It has changed the way we worked. It has not had, on average, negative impact on the job quality. Okay, so that's a little bit what the story that we have. But in some of the research that we're doing right now, we've looked more specifically at algorithmic management. And here what we see, we unpack algorithmic management in terms of monitoring performance, allocating tasks, and schedule and work. And what we try to see is how does that actually impact the way that workers feel about their work. And while we see that there is not really any impact on the way, or there could actually be a slightly positive impact how workers perceive their work, is when we look at allocating tasks and scheduling work. Here, that actually does not seem to have a negative impact at well-being at work and the way that workers perceive their job strains. However, once we go into monitoring performance, here we do actually see that there is an association with more negative impact on job strains and worker well-being than when there's not a monitoring of performance. So we do see that there are slightly differences in terms of how, when we look at algorithmic management, in terms of the different ways algorithmic management interacts with the workplace. Once you unpack that, you start seeing different interactions. So I think that's also something that's very important and interesting to be able to unpack and discuss a little bit. How do we actually deal with workplace, with the monitoring performance in the workplace and the impact this has? Again, with regard to the climate change, I won't talk about the green transition. Here as well, looking over time, we see that there's a larger part of the workforce today being impacted by extreme heat while working. So we've always had about 5% in the workplace where they are often impacted by extreme heat. Chefs, people that work close to furnaces. But the part of the population working population that is sometimes exposed to extreme heat, that has increased from 18 to 24%. So it's more or less a quarter of the workforce today. And here we see, once again, it's not on average, it's agriculture, transport, logistics, and so forth. So specific occupations that are really impacted by the increase in temperatures. And so those are also some of the items where we see that the change in context is impacting on the way that work is performed and on the job quality, and is something that can be unpacked and dealt with as well. I think I would leave it there. So I think that we do have a very solid tradition at European level to engage with competitiveness and a social agenda at the same time and try to make them speak together. Social investment would be the way that we would coin this as well. And we can maybe get back to that at a certain point. And there's certain very specific items that one could actually deal with at the current stage.
Is there anything very specific you'd put to the Irish presidency that they ought to focus on in the next 6 months?
But I think that, as I said, some of the pain points that we saw out of the work that we did last year on the child guarantee, the items that the Job Quality Act that is coming up, these are things that come out in our data as well as items that should be engaged with and pushed forward.
Cool.
Yeah.
So there's opportunities there.
So I think there's an opportunity to unpack some of these items. Yeah.
Cool. I have one, you'll have to forgive, one really general question for you before turning to Nicola. That there's a bunch of people who are literal experts in the field of employment policy, industrial relations, etc. But there's others who aren't, such as myself. When you talk about a quality job, and you mentioned that quality jobs on aggregate for women, or jobs have become less high quality, right? Is that, sorry if I misrepresent what you said, but just to give a sense of like, what are the features for people to be vigilant when they go to work themselves? What are the features of the metrics that you can look at to determine whether a job is higher or lower quality? You mentioned strenuousness, extreme heat, stuff like that. What are the different things that feed into the quality of the job? Okay,
so at the job quality indicator at Eurofound, we've got 7 dimensions. So the dimensions would be physical environment, the psychological environment, it would be earnings, it would be the working time quality. So all the items that are linked to when you perform your job. And we go out and we ask 35,000 workers in the European Working Conditions Survey. We have a questionnaire, it's 120 questions, it lasts 45 minutes, and we ask them all these questions about their jobs so that afterwards we can construct our job quality indicator that is based on a multidimensional index of what job quality be. There are a lot of ways of defining a job quality. The European Union is putting out another job quality definition, which is, I would say, it's more an employment quality index rather than a job one. We really focus on the job and try to measure dimensions that are important within your job that you perform every day. And how does that impact your motivation, your engagement at work, and that the more motivated, the more engaged you are, the more productive, innovative you are in your job, and also how it impacts in your well-being, your working life.
35,000 audits, you said?
Yeah.
That's a phenomenal amount. Thanks a million. I'm sure we'll come back to job quality when we move into the Q&A. Really happy to conclude this part of the discussion with you, Nicola, that we're really pleased that you're here representing IBEC. IBEC, our employer federation in Ireland, represents the interests of employers, but has a really well-documented, positive approach to matters of social policy, and has behaved really constructively by European standards, if I may say, really constructively in this space. So we're really pleased that IBEC sent the representative, and thanks for your time. Please.
Thanks a million, Barry, and thanks a million for having me. It's a pleasure to sit on the panel with everyone here. And on a lot of things, I think we're very much aligned. I absolutely agree. I think the Irish presidency is coming at a really pivotal time. You know, we're really being tested, I think, at the moment with the global uncertainty, AI, shifting economic pressures, and I think there is a really significant role that that Ireland can play as we look at the presidency. And I completely agree with you, Barry, with the unity that I think Ireland really can bring. Unity to the EU at a really important time. So I do agree that I think it's a really pivotal time. There's been a lot of talk about balance, between competitiveness and social Europe. I really don't see them as opposing forces, and I don't think we should see them as opposing forces. When I think of competitiveness, I do see it as a really fundamental building block for a social Europe. And I think if we can look at them in that terms, I think we can get to a place where both sides of the coin are being met. And if you look at the value, if you look at the priorities that the government have placed on the presidency, I think we are seeing that balance when we see competitiveness, values, and security being the three pillar keys, key pillars of the presidency. We are seeing a balance there between competitiveness and values on either side. So I think it is important not to look at competitiveness and a social Europe as a zero-sum game where one must be sacrificed for the other. I think we can look at them as more building blocks to achieve each other. And I suppose when I look at competitiveness and the future of the EU social model, I think there's three pillars from an employer's point of view that are really crucial. And the first is stability. And businesses, they can handle high standards, but businesses can't handle uncertainty. So stability and certainty are absolutely crucial. Second of all, predictability is key, I think. And I think when we're looking at new pieces of social legislation, we have to ask, is this going to achieve its objective? We might all be aligned on the problem. We might all be aligned on the objective of a piece of regulation, but where we often diverge is on whether the regulation is proportionate to the objective and whether it will achieve its objective. And third, I think agility is something that the EU has been a little bit behind on in recent years. The world isn't waiting on the EU to finish deliberations on certain key topics. So I think agility has to be a key element of the social Europe as well. And I think if you look at the Pay Transparency Directive as maybe an example of putting those pillars into practice, we're very much aligned on the objective of the Pay Transparency Directive to achieve gender equality in Europe. But the fact of the matter is, it's such a multifaceted issue. It will not be resolved or fixed by the Pay Transparency Directive. So we have to look at that problem as a much more whole of society issue. Childcare, caring responsibilities, early education, education throughout gender stereotyping in education. There's so many different factors which feed into the gender pay gap. They are not going to be fixed alone by the Pay Transparency Directive. But the other thing when you look at stability and predictability, but the employers I advise are behind the Pay Transparency Directive. But the fact of the matter is they don't know how to comply with it because there are elements within the directive that are very uncertain and don't have the legal certainty that employers need in order to put them into practice. The EGA toolkit itself recognises the job evaluation process is a 6-month process. So when we look for delays or stop the clock or a little bit more time, it's actually recognising what EGA recognised. This is a long process. It's not easy. And employers, I think, need to be given the time to be able to do this right. And my fear for the Pay Transparency Directive is if we're all rushing to an unknown deadline, it's going to be done really badly. Confidence in the directive is going to be really impacted, both for employers and employees, and I don't think that's going to help anyone. So when you're looking at EU regulation, I think you have to look at stability, predictability, and agility as being really key features of when I talk about competitiveness being an important factor. But I do think, as I say, that I think the Irish presidency priorities are priorities I think are doing a pretty good job of achieving that balance of not looking at values versus competitiveness, but looking at values, competitiveness, and security and resilience as being really interdependent priorities that will ultimately, hopefully, get us where we want to be.
Thanks a million, Nicola. I'm going to give everybody a chance to respond to what has been said after you in the panel thus far before turning to you guys. And I'm not going to make you responsible, Nicola, for the entire kind of employment class in Ireland or anywhere else. But I want to go back to one little thing. It was Esther mentioned it when she spoke about, let me check my notes, about AI and the potential for exploitation. And then it also came up in Maria's remarks about the allocation and scheduling of work. Is there anything that you can share with us about what your members are saying about AI and its influence on their practices, and especially how it may connect with matters of social policy, if you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's employers are at very different levels of preparedness around AI, a bit like workers, I think. So while we have some members, and it's not just based on size, but we have some members, some businesses who AI has not reached them at all. Other companies who AI is really at a really central part of what they do, with great buy-in from a lot of their employees. But I actually think there is already quite a lot of regulation around AI. I mean, if you look at the GDPR, there's provisions around effectively algorithmic management in there. You can't make decisions without human in the loop that will have an impact on a work. That's already in the GDPR. So even when I'm advising employers on implementing AI in their workplace, there is regulation that they still need to be aware of and they still need to comply with. And I think it's one of those again, a topic that we really have to look at regulation as being a value add. Are we actually adding value to this discussion? Are we regulating for regulation's sake, or are we regulating because something, appears like a big development, which it is, but what's already there that might already be, regulating that space? So I would say, when it comes to AI, employers are at different levels of preparedness. The employers I speak to, that human in the loop is still a very, at the center of it all. So that I suppose that's kind of the early stages of where I think we're at with AI.
Thanks, Nicola. There's stuff I've been reading recently, and there's experts on the panel here, but it's about, kind of platform workers and people who are, it used to be a management consultancy firm that would come and tell the employer, I'm sorry, we're sacking our whatever sector because the management consultancy firm told us. Now it's a big AI, or the app tells you actually you've gotten too many 3 or 4 star reviews after your journey or after your service or whatever. The impact is obviously so profound on people's lived experience and their employment. Esther, I'm going to turn to you first and then work our way back up the panel before going out to the group. Nicola was talking about stability, predictability, agility. Does that cohere with your view?
So there's a certain inconsistency in the positions. And I'm not going to hold you, but the legislation on achieving the climate targets was well debated, was well predicted, and some companies made huge investments to achieve it. And then when there's a rollback, the companies that do the right thing then say, well, why did I do that? So you're rewarding the companies who hold back and who hold out and who put in place quite enormous amounts of money on lobbying, because we've been astounded at European level, like it's gone off the scales now, the amount of lobbying in the European Parliament by interests that are consistent with American multinational interests in particular, but not only. So for us, it's very important when laws are passed that member states and companies are told in the clearest possible terms that's the law and you have to comply. And in that way, the companies that do the right thing are rewarded. They're not disadvantaged. And another one of our demands in that arena, because we want to be about, because I actually take the point about not always the stick, right? I actually get that. But there is a problem that when we take the stick to the companies who are doing the right things. So if you take public procurement, so you've got trillions, 3 trillion, I can't remember the number now, I think it's 2 trillion of public money going to services, whether it's the security guards and ministries, whether it's the food that's been bought by hospitals, or all of that money going to the lowest price. People running a nursing home on the basis of lowest price. I can't think of a worse way of choosing a contract provider to run a nursing home than on the lowest price. So for us, changing the public procurement rules, which will also fall under the Irish presidency, because in 3 weeks' time, the proposal should come out. The reform of the public procurement rules to say that companies that have quality jobs, that invest in the workforce, that have higher standards, that have collective bargaining, that have collective agreements, that do all of the things that the social model asks them to do, they should have a good chance of winning the contract. They shouldn't be always underbid by the companies that try to compete on the lowest terms and conditions, on cutthroat standards, on literally the lowest of everything. So this will be another chance for the Irish presidency to stand with that positive vision of the future, and to give the full backing, and the way in which the agenda is developed. So for us, once the law is passed, the deadlines are all very predictable, and member states and companies need to do what's necessary to understand and learn. And after all, the captains of industry should be able to work out how much they're paying their workers.
Just circle. I want to come back when you get into Q&A and what you said about the European preference as well, but I want to keep things moving. Do you want to comment on anything else that was said after your remarks, Esther, by Shane or Maria? You can pass, but just in case there is something on.
No, the only thing I wanted to say is about the amount of working people I meet who want access to a training course. Amount of employers who I meet who want access to trained workers throughout Europe. And then you meet working people who there's no course available, they can't afford the course, they can't get time off for the course. And then employers saying, Esther, I can't afford to invest in the workforce because the competition agenda, the competitiveness agenda is now so sharp that there's zero wriggle room. And if I was to spend it on buying a bit of a shed out the back, I could say that's an asset. But if I was to invest in the training of the workforce, that's just a cost. And so you get, so the tax treatment of workers who are making that investment. And I think one of the key determinants of a quality job is how it helps you get prepared for the future. And I have no idea how we put that in a matrix. The way in which we were thinking of doing it was to have a right to training, a right to time off for training, an obligation on an employer to have a just transition plan with the workforce, like something in that space. So if there was any opportunity to advance on that during the Irish presidency, I think that would be really, really helpful.
It's really interesting because it might be costly, but there's a policy solution there for the problem that you're identifying. It's not trying to stop the sea. Shayna, would you like to comment on anything that came after?
No, I think the only thing I was thinking about was in terms of the you said there's really no conflict between business and social Europe, and I think that's I would agree on principle. I just I was wondering what you think about sort of the omnibus legislation and the rollback of kind of climate legislation or the obligation to fulfill that, following on from Esther's comments. But I was thinking about that because they're making it, smaller SMEs are less responsible now. And you really have to be a fairly sizable company to be obligated. And then I was reading about sort of the breakdown of AMCO, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's one of it's a stream, and it's going to change our, sorry, I should know this, but I can't remember what it stands for. Anyway, it would have a dramatic effect on European climate. So it would be really doing the right thing in rolling that back in the name of competitiveness.
If you wish to respond, by all means, do, Nicola.
Yeah, I think it isn't, and I think probably we would have had members on both, some people who had driven on and prepared, and then would have been a little bit frustrated to see it wrote back, for want of a better word. But I think what you do have to look at, and maybe not specifically on that, but in the broader term, we are really seeing, and there was a study done by Business Europe in the last couple of months about where is the real burden on employers with regulation. And there is a huge burden around reporting. And while it might seem a small thing and not a cost increasing thing for employers to do, or, well, you have to report on this, so let's report on pay transparency as well. There is actually a huge burden increase when there's a lot of reporting. And I think you have to look at then, what is the impact and effect of that reporting? Is it achieved? As I say, we're all agreed, I think, on the climate targets, but is this going to achieve that? So I think that is something that you always have to be looking at. And I think probably one of the reasons or factors around the omnibus was potentially a lack of due diligence in the first place. And I think we're seeing that with pay transparency as well. There was a lack of due diligence done during the legislative process, which has forced these debates and questions over whether we're ready for it now or whether we need another 6 or 12 months. I think it's showing the importance of due diligence in the legislative process to really delve into how is this going to apply in practice before we finalise legislation, so that when it is finalised, we do have the stability and certainty we need, that we won't have to, in 6 months or a year or 2 years, amend it. Because that isn't helping anyone when you're rushing this way and coming back. We really do need, I think, a real focus on due diligence in the legislative process to avoid that happening again.
Final word, if you wish, Maria, before you go out to the audience. Would you like to comment on anything that's been said?
No, but I would like to raise two issues that we haven't discussed yet. That's also on the Irish presidency, and that's the disability employment gap. So that's, again, one of the pain points out of the European Pillar of Social Rights, that we have really not advanced on it. The employment gap for people with disabilities is actually increasing instead of decreasing. Now, this could be a statistical artifact, okay, but the thing is, like, it's not decreasing as one could expect. And that Eurofound as well is doing a lot of work trying to figure, to gather good practices in terms of how can you actually create a wraparound service so that you can enable a more holistic approach to integrating people with disabilities into society and into the working life. So what's the role of the state, civil society, of the employers in that sense? I think that's an extremely important agenda to move forward as well during the Irish presidency, and I think well geared up to. And then the last one, well, we actually started out, you had mentioned it, the housing agenda, right? Where actually, when we look at the housing, and here, when I looked into the presidency agenda, it's not under social, it's under competitiveness, right? So housing is really together with competitiveness, and it's true that you can't drive a competitive society if you can't house, if people can't find the housing, right? So it goes together with being able to get education, being upskilled, having healthcare, health needs met. And having a house over an adequate and affordable house over your head.
I'm really glad you mentioned both of those points, and I think they're like, with us in terms of the political leadership in Ireland, there's a lot of kind of personal and professional interest in matters of disability policy. So I think it's a very good one to flag. Now we're at the point. Can anyone indicate if you'd like to ask a question? I see at least one here, which we'll start with, and then Sean, how you bind. So we'll start with Seamus, and then we'll come to you, Sean, afterwards. If you can identify yourself, please, Seamus.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Seamus Hannon, a senior researcher here. Kind of following up on that point, I wanted to ask about social security and kind of gaps in social security and protection, and particularly, and not just, but particularly when that's also relevant, I think, to Europe's competitiveness and our innovativeness. So, for example, if you have unhappy employees and maybe they actually want to try and start their own business, but in a lot of European countries, there's gaps. That's a very scary prospect, because we think we're good at social security, but some countries are actually quite weak there. And housing is another area where that can sometimes be quite stark. I mean, I know people personally, and probably many people here do, if you're going for a mortgage, changing your job might just not be an option for you for a time period that's just too long. And that is both bad social security wise, but also for an employee's ability to switch job and help our economy. The other thing I wanted to ask about is skills. Just if you have thoughts on the Union of Skills initiative. There's also big barriers within the EU when it comes to qualifications and getting them recognised in other member states. That's still a surprisingly serious issue. If you've thoughts on addressing that. And just touching on something you did mention earlier, is there a growing problem with very high skilled employees who are just not seeing the jobs proportionate to the skills that they've achieved? I think Esther mentioned, we're asking people to do all these things. They're doing it, and they're still not getting what they've been promised. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Seamus. Are any of those questions directed at any of the panel in particular?
Wait.
Okay. Thanks. So we're going to take one more question from Sean Haughey, and then I'll invite each of you to answer to whatever bits of the questions that you'd like. Please, Sean.
Thank you. Sean Haughey, former Fianna Fáil TD and Minister of State for Lifelong Learning. There was mention there of Ireland's presidency and Ireland being a bridge between the United States and the European Union. And in the context of US multinational companies, the tech oligarchs, the social media oligarchs, we're told that there is a lot of lobbying going on in relation to the Irish presidency, specifically in an Irish context, and the need to dumb down regulation, so to speak. I'm just wondering how big of a threat do you see that, particularly in an Irish context, and we're assuming the presidency, we have our corporate taxation, which is so important for our public spending. How big of a threat do you see the pressure coming from US multinational companies to deregulate? How big of a threat is that, do you see, for the European social model?
Phenomenal. Let's start with those. Thank you so much, Sean. So we'll have maybe one other round of questions after this, but we'll go this way. And as I said, invite each of you. You can pass or you can jump on any of the questions that you wish. Esther.
I think you're right. It's an absolutely huge threat. We already saw that letter some months ago from President Trump, where he wrote through the embassies to everybody, saying, if you're supplying anything to American embassies or to America, you have to get rid of your diversity, equality, and inclusion programs. And when companies didn't do that, they lost the contracts. And then that went out as a chill effect around to a lot of companies. So for sure, and then on top of that, we all see the game that is being played with the tariffs. That we'll play off cars if you do something on AI, or so we see a quite weaponized trade policy, and it being driven, as you said, by this 2025, 2029 agenda, very explicitly against social Europe, trying to make Europe as much like America, so that American multinationals will either be able to come in and buy very quickly, which is something on the 20th company regime I didn't get into, but it will make it very quickly to buy very large enterprises. So for us, this is why we have time and time again, and a call would be to the Irish presidency is you've got to stand up to that, like Europe did when the threats came to Greenland. We need that same solidarity when the attack comes for our social systems, as was shown then. And I'm fearful about this divide and conquer between the member states. Some member states being heavily dependent on export of quite heavy industry and energy intensive industries, and then the discussion that you then have with member states like our own, who might be saying, well, we actually see the value of a diverse workforce, of Europe being a great place for people to come and have a family, and to be able to live a life of respect and freedom and safety. And so it really is. I mean, as a colleague from IBEX said, it really is a pivotal moment for us. And I'm very of concerns, but also I'm proud that it's Ireland that has this presidency, and I hope that we can put up a strong stand against the bullying from those from big tech in particular, that we can stand up to them. The one example that went completely under the radar, which I was actually surprised that the business community didn't come out more about, was there was a directive that was going to establish the liability in the circumstance something goes wrong with AI. So it was going to establish that the AI companies were going to be responsible. So if you had an accident, or if there was a financial loss, or that something, whatever the bad thing was, then it wouldn't be the worker who would be held responsible. It would be the owner of the AI, who would be held responsible. But that whole directive just off the table now. So that's going to mean courts by courts, circumstance by circumstance is going to establish law that's going to be different in every member state, that's going to be different. So the call for consistency, predictability, knowability is aided by having regulation that's clear, that's appropriate, that's that's easy to understand. So this what I'm saying about I think there's a strong argument to be made that Europe can be competitive by having great standards, so people have confidence in what they buy, whether it's AI or medicine or baby formula, and that you're confident about what you're buying, but also if something goes wrong, that there's a protection in place for you.
Thanks, Mary.
It's a really good question though, Sean.
Shana, do you want to have a cut at either of the questioners' questions?
I would just, with the US, I think Trump's much weaker politically than he was a couple of years ago when he was threatening. I mean, I think he is, but, and he might be even weaker after November. So I would be curious how that's going to change after, once, once November elections take place. But also there is some movement to try to regulate, to make AI responsible. It is court by court in the United States, but I'm optimistic that there will be some kind of push for legislation. So I don't think all of the influence from the US is necessarily negative. I think some of it might be actually quite positive, especially the idea that we need an alternative vision to Project 2025, and that could influence the European Union in the sense that it can't just be siloed legislation. It has to also be a vision of what Europe stands for. I think the values piece for the EU presidency, for me personally, is the most interesting piece. How do you articulate that and act upon it?
Excellent, thank you. Much has been said already, Maria, but Maria Nicola, would you like to respond to any of the questions?
I can try to respond briefly to two very big items. Like one of them is on the social protection part, right? So that's a huge question, and there are many answers that can be given. But there is this recommendation from the European level in terms of access to social protection, right? So everybody should have access to social protection, which is a really important principle. And clearly, self-employed are perceived as being problematic in that sense because many countries have holes in terms of protecting self-employed in many ways. And it's also the bridging between employed and self-employed in the social protection system. And some countries have tried to build the bridges. I think France has tried to build bridges, Belgium, the Netherlands have done it in very different ways with very different outcomes as well, right? So, but there is a lot of attempt in terms of trying to build these bridges. But they are very different employment statuses, right? So, and they give very different rights in the social protection. And so the bridge it's not always very clear cut in terms of what it looks like. And then getting to the skills item. So when we looked into the European Working Conditions Survey, so the fact, we have what we call overqualified and underqualified, right? So the overqualified are the workers that are in jobs where they don't use their skills to the full, where they could do more. And that's a consistent phenomenon. It's nothing new, okay? We've always had that. And it's very different across the different countries. Some countries have like smaller percentages, others, and I think the percentage is around 20% of workers think that they feel overqualified in their jobs. Then we've got the underqualified, those that say, I need actually more skills to be able to perform my job. And here again, the percentage is slightly higher, 30. Can you remember, Mary? I think, yeah, it's a little bit higher, around 30. Where actually the workers say, like, I need more skills to be able to perform my job. We've always had these two groups, and they fluctuate a bit. Now, what we're having today is a conversation about the graduate market, right? So to this discussion that we've always had about underqualified and overqualified, we're getting the whole discussion about the graduate labor market at the moment, where there's a discussion, is this AI, is it not AI? And I think the jury is still out there, whether it's just a slowdown of the economy that's kind of labor hoarding after the pandemic, slowing down of the labor market, everybody's putting brakes on, and they're investing in AI, so they can't take more graduates in, or are we actually seeing a complete shift in terms of entry-level jobs? The US, they seem to see its entry-level jobs. Europe, it's less clear-cut, okay, much less clear-cut in terms of what's going on. And I guess we'll just have to be monitoring and watching out to ensure that that we do not get into the situation we were in the 80s and in the 2000s, where we had a huge cohort of young people graduating into no jobs. And that's an absolute disaster for the entire future. And I think that's the one where we really need to learn from the lessons of the 80s, the lessons of the 90s and 20s. We don't seem to kind of learn too much from this, and be vigilant now about making sure that we actually make sure that the young people graduating, that they move on, they move into the jobs, that we provide them with the pathways into the jobs, the good jobs, right? The quality jobs in that sense. So I think that's where I would stop.
Do we know anything, Maria, about the long-term outcomes for people who feel overqualified for their jobs? I have a follow-up question that explains why I'm asking you this, but do we know anything what happens to people in terms of motivation, retention, productivity, anything if you're overqualified in your job?
I'm sure that we've looked into it. I'm pretty sure that Eurofund, there's somewhere in there a chapter about this.
Sure.
I just don't have it on my mind. My gut feeling would tell me that you would feel slightly less motivated in your job than if you had your skills matching your job set, right? But this also comes into the whole question about prospects. What are the prospects that you have in your job? Do you have any prospects moving forward? And since we've had a fairly buoyant labor market until recently, these figures are really good. We had people really workers felt they had prospects. They felt very happy in their jobs. So there's also the economic cycle that goes to it. It's not only a structural thing. There's also the economic cycle that really plays on these factors. But I don't have it on top of my head. I'm sure we have a chapter somewhere.
What you're making me think of is over various rounds of industrial revolution, when there's churn and technological change. I'm sure this happens. But what I realize now is today I feel, speaking for myself, just about qualified for my job, right? I have just the qualities that are required. But next week, month, year, that might radically change, right? Based on the advent of radical technological change. I reiterate, that's not a new thing. It's since the steam engine and everything since that's happened. But it will be interesting what happens to those cohorts where you feel just about qualified now, and then in the future you actually feel out of control or not qualified. Do you want to say something?
I was just going to add that one of the issues that might be arising with the early career researchers, but I wanted to add that there are places like Romania that have lost a decent chunk of their population to out-migration. And I don't know if in terms of social protection, if the European Union is conscious enough of I think some of the workers from Poland who maybe went to the UK before Brexit have gone back to Poland. But I think places like Romania, the depopulation, especially in rural areas, is a serious issue. And I'm not sure that there's a combined crises between early career early career workers not being able to find work, but also some states don't have a robust, their demography is not very robust, and a lot of their population has left. So I think that also might be an issue that the European Union is going to have to pay closer attention to.
Can I get it? So I think this is a really good point, right? Because when we look at the working population in Europe, it's kind of flatlining, slightly decreasing. This decrease, if you hone in on Central and Eastern European Union, it's going like that. Right. Their working age population is leaving. Okay, their birth rates have been fairly low for a long time, so they got less people actually coming into the working age at that point. But they're also leaving, and so at the European level, there's this initiative, Right to Stay. So we at the Eurofund, we don't call it Right to Stay; we say Freedom to Stay, and we're actually looking into it, and we have a publication coming out really soon where we look at the regional level in terms of what would make it attractive for citizens to remain, to stay, so that they feel that they have the freedom actually to move or not move. And here we see huge variations, right? Poland, they had an in-migration because economically it was going really good. The society was really able to offer a prospect for returnees. Romania, this does not seem to actually be the case. I would say yet. I'm being an optimist. But so we have this project looking at regional level and building in this in terms of what's the quality, what are the kind of prospects that the regions offer to their citizens and provides them freedom to stay. So it's a really good question because it's important as well within the European Union and the whole cohesion of the project.
The right to stay, the freedom to stay, really, really interesting concept. The question came in about it actually, which you basically just resolved.
Okay.
But thinking beyond the scope of the presidency, right? Ireland has a role there, I think, given that you look at the past 200 years of this place, that's something that feels very familiar, the kind of depopulation of the country as people went abroad for opportunities. Okay, Nicola, nearly everything's been said, but not by everybody. Would you like to add anything?
Just to add to that skills point, because I do think it is a huge point, and I completely agree, Esther. When we talk about quality job, I think that's a very hard concept to define what a quality job is will change person to person, will also change during the course of your career. But I absolutely agree that one fundamental is continuing upskilling so that you are best placed to take up really good employment when you need to. It's actually, I think Ireland does a lot well around skills. So in some ways, I know even in Business Europe, a lot of other member states are looking to Ireland for some things that we have done really well around skills. But I do agree there's more to be done on recognition and micro credentials, and there is a lot we can do around skills, and it's a key ingredient in any quality jobs roadmap, I think.
As is so often the case, as we approach the final whistle, I've noticed at least 2 questions. So there's Kevin P. O'Kelly and Prunchius de Rossa. Does anyone else want to come in? This will be the last round. And Mary McCaughey. So we're going to take the 3 of them together, please. No, go in the order I said. Kevin, Prunchius, and Mary, please. We'll go Kevin, then Prunchius, then Mary.
Yeah. Thank you, Barry. I hadn't intended to intervene and just sit here quietly. And thank you for the welcome when I came in. I've just finished a European project on artificial intelligence, and some of the points that have just been made sort of came back to me. And in this project, in fact, the ETY were partners in it, IBEC were partners, and as part of our research, we used the European Foundation Working Conditions Survey quite substantially, and a lot of support from the European Foundation for the project. Shane, I'm sorry, task wasn't there. One of the key findings we had, we were looking at the application of artificial intelligence in 7 member states in 5 sectors. And just 2 key issues that came up for me was, or comes out of the research, was the major gap between the application of artificial intelligence right across the 27 member states. You've got the Nordic countries and Luxembourg way ahead of all of the other countries. And you've got countries like Romania and Bulgaria where they have 3% of use of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is a generic term. It covers all sorts of different applications. Ireland and Italy more or less sit in the center of the 27, so we're quite a distance behind. And Malta is very enthusiastic about it. So there's a big challenge here as we go forward and artificial intelligence becomes a bigger aspect of the employment and skills for the Eastern and Balkan and Eastern member states. And also within the member states, within all of the 7 member states we looked at, there's a major gap between the big companies, the multinational companies introducing artificial intelligence, but small and medium-sized companies are not doing it. So there's a gap developing within the member states, but also across the member states in the application of artificial intelligence. We finished this at Easter, this project at Easter, and if anybody's interested in the reports, the reports that we have from that.
Most interesting. And Kevin, just for those online and posterity, you might just introduce yourself and tell us you might just introduce yourself for those online.
Oh my.
In one line, I'll do it for you, and it'll be embarrassing if you don't. So.
Such a big fear. Anyway, yeah, I mean, I don't know where to start. I've worked at the European Foundation for a number of years. I've known Sheena. I think I was one of the first people you met when you came. And of course, I've worked with Esther when she was here in Congress and also in the ETUC.
Absolutely.
I was an associate researcher with the ETUI for over 20 years.
That's plenty. And I thank you for your service, Kevin.
And was an advisor in the Department of Labour to the Ministry.
So more than accomplished. Thank you very much. I might just hand it over to
of
this institute, indeed, and actually to another very significant figure of Irish politics.
Thanks very much. Prunchius de Rossa, member of the institute here, but also task. I'm very happy that this meeting is taking place. I mean, we've had 4 really rich contributions here to this debate. For me, South of Europe is about building a European Union which is conscious of the human dignity of every single person that lives within our area, and also accepts its responsibility for contributing to the rest of the world as well. And so I don't see employers and employees as enemies. They each have a role, but I think there is inevitably a conflict because of the nature of the relationship. And I see also a conflict, and I just ask you this quick question, between the notion of agility and the notion of certainty. There is no doubt at all in my mind that business needs certainty within certain parameters, if you like, to thrive. But agility, depending on how it's defined, can undermine that certainty. And I just wonder, what is the limit for the employer side? I mean, in theory, you could abolish all regulation, but that would be a disaster for business. So where is the where is the limit? That's the question.
Thank you, Prunchius. And Lindsay, you might just bring the mic to Mary McCarthy for the final question. Prunchius is too modest to have mentioned he was also a Chocolate Dola and MEP for a long time.
Indeed, and a very good friend of Eurofund. Eurofund is getting a good run today, so thank you for that. I just wanted to, I was triggered a little bit by your comment there where you said job quality is difficult, it changes all the time. I mean, I think that's the point that Eurofund would make, is that it doesn't really change because there's a framework. There's a concept which exists, which is really well defined as to what constitutes a good quality job. And it's determined by a whole range of indicators, which are then very well evidence-based. And I think to come back to your point, that's such a pivotal, critical perspective that we need to take when it comes to competitiveness, because there was the question here about good quality jobs, or feeling, that you're in, highly qualified jobs. I mean, there were more good quality jobs produced out of the net number of new jobs over the last 12 or so years, 14 years, than there were any other types of jobs. So good quality jobs for Europe are good. They're on the up, and they are being secured by people with good qualifications, so these are good things. Where things aren't so good are, for example, with the AI and women. Women are less likely to engage with AI. So we need to watch that for the future, for gender equality. And that comes back, I think, to what I think Maria said earlier, which is really what today should be about, is that, what is Europe's, unique selling point when it comes to the US and others? It has to be about the social model, because that's what differentiates us from the other global trading partners. And we need to make this our USP. This has to be our value added that we bring to the table. And we can do that across so many different aspects. And to try and separate out the social Europe, which suddenly you see an entire business community almost zoning out when we talk about anti-poverty or gender equality or disability, but without those things being in place, and without us actually moving forward on these, we don't have a competitiveness strategy. And I think rather than separating them into two separate places, which is what we tend to do when we have these debates, that we should really be seeing them as an integral part of the same thing. And that really what we have to bring to the table as Europeans is that we are different from the US, and we can prove it by investing in these different elements over the next period of time. So it's not really a question, it was more a trigger that pointed me into that there. So.
Really, really appropriate, and just hear Mary from start to finish. We are over time now, but there were some really good contributions. I'm going to invite each of you, going reverse order from Nicola back to Esther, respond to any of the questions. And if there's anything else that has occurred to you about the Irish presidency you haven't mentioned, please do feel free to mention. And I'll just at this stage thank each of you, because we're against time. So Nicola.
Thanks a million for the two questions. I agree. I mean, it can be a difficult balance to achieve between agility and certainty. And I suppose what I'd say is, excuse me, I think there's some key fundamental requirements. And it probably goes back to what I was saying earlier around sufficient, adequate due diligence before making rules. Trying to consider, are they really adding value, or are they just adding regulation? And I kind of, even just to link it to the quality job side, I take your point about there is a well-defined framework as to what constitutes a quality job, but is that suitable for EU-wide regulation? You know, there's a framework which might define something, and then there's something that is suitable and relevant for regulation, and those two things I don't think are always aligned. And I think that's where I would be coming from the EU point of view around regulation. Do we need the EU to regulate here, or is it something that the EU can support? You know, and that's, I think, a key thing. And I do think at a very basic level around certainty, it is just making sure that employers who want to comply with employment law know what that looks like. And that's not always the case. And that's a pretty basic requirement for employers, but it's not always the case. And as currently defined and with the current guidance we have around the Pay Transparency Directive, it can't be said about the Pay Transparency Directive either. So we need, at a very basic level, that certainty as to what does compliance look like. But I completely agree around the competitiveness and the social agenda. They are interdependent. They're not two separate things. They are very much interdependent. But ultimately, we do need to be able to pay for our social model. So we do need businesses to want to invest in Europe. We want businesses to want to employ more people in Europe, not employ fewer people in Europe. So we do need to have that competitiveness check on things. And when I say a competitiveness check, I think it could be interpreted as deregulation or not regulation, but it is just having an eye on, is this going to make a business want to employ more people in the EU or fewer people in the EU? And if the answer is fewer, then we do need to look at whether the proposed regulation is achieving its objective.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Maria?
Okay, I think there's something else also to add to the point in terms of job quality. Well, I would actually say broaden it and say living conditions and working conditions, right? So Europe wants to be competitive in terms of attractive talent, right? So we are in a space where we got the labor force, but we know we also need to attract people from abroad to come and work in the European Union. And here it's very clear, Europe is not going to compete on wages, right? We're not going to compete on wages with regard to the US. But what we do compete on, and why people want to come and work in Europe, is because we got working and living conditions up to a certain standard that actually attract. We've got certainty, we've got security, we've got good schools, we've got good healthcare. You can actually access it without being completely ruined. And these are some of the items that we should continue to foster. And I think so when we talk about competitiveness, for me, that's really important. As you say, it's a combined agenda. But it's not only it's also a combined agenda to be attractive for labor force that we need to come here, and also for companies to come here and want to settle down, because they do want actually be able to open up headquarters and have their workers being secure in the street, accessing good schools, having housing that are adequate. And so in that sense, there's the regulatory environment, but there's also the whole living and working conditions environment that is important. I think that's about what the European competitiveness agenda is about as well. It's providing that environment, not only on a general basis.
Shane, you got to follow.
I totally take your point about reporting burden. I mean, I can tell as a charity, we have an increasing reporting burden that affects our internal operations. I sympathize with that. But I think it would be good to look at it broadly. Like, let's say the anti-poverty strategy at a European level. There are almost 100 million people in Europe who live in poverty, including a sizable number of children. And the ambitions to reduce the poverty level are not that high. But at the same time, there's not a lot of teeth in the directive. So I think if we're going to look at regulation of business and rolling it back or making reporting requirements less burdensome, at the same time to keep up with the Social Europe agenda, we have to put more teeth into the legislation and the funding around like reducing poverty levels, ensuring that we don't, coastal communities are protected. There was a recent report that Ireland needs to act urgently on its coastal communities because the population is going to have to be transferred out of there. So I think you can't, there's business, and if we're going to link the two, then Social Europe has to be supported by a firmer and stronger regulation in that sense.
Thanks very much, Shana. So final word to you, Esther.
So there's three things. The first is on the reporting. So Reporting is the way in which the company demonstrates that it's complying with the law. And it's a way of addressing very often at member state level, low levels of labour inspectors. So the way in which you address low levels of labour inspectors is you have more reporting requirements so that it's possible to be able to look at, and in the public domain in particular, then organisations can spot out, well, actually that doesn't match with the reality. So the reporting requirements are only that you report that you are complying with the law. They're not, they're not something extra. And my experience of dealing with employers when it comes to pay in particular is that if you're half an hour late, they'll know that and they'll stop you for your half an hour late. So they have very detailed information, and they have algorithms now that do it within seconds. It's no longer, somebody looking at a clock. So my experience is that employers know the amount of pay that they're giving to workers, and they already have all that information, and that they would be able to meet the requirements with. And what surprised me is that there's no AI company selling a patch. Like it's an obvious thing that, if I was able to do it, I'd do it. It's like, because I could make a fortune with all the employers who are having trouble complying, and that you'd be able to do it. So that's my first point, that I have that information. The second is then the importance of not disadvantaging those companies who are complying with the rules, whatever the rules are. And another example of that was 2 weeks, or was it a week ago, under the Cyprus presidency, a proposal was put forward to remove from CAP, the agricultural policy, the protections that say you cannot get CAP if you don't respect employment laws. It's a reasonable thing to say if you're getting public money as a farmer and you're employing people that you respect the law. But there's a proposal under the Cyprus presidency to remove that because it's too much regulation. So it's not, if you like, there needs to be an interrogation on case-by-case basis of exactly what the proposal to remove is and what the impact on the most vulnerable. Agricultural workers are among the most vulnerable workers in the world, and same true in Europe. Then the final point I wanted to make, because we didn't get to, and it also gets me to say something about the disability, which I really congratulate Ireland on. And if you don't know if you know this, but Ireland was an Ireland ICTU IBEC were an example of a best practice at the International Labour Organization for work on disability. So we have a lot, that we already work on, and that we can highlight and spotlight. But the issue that we haven't got to is Ukraine, and the opening of the discussion on the enlargement. So Ukraine, Moldova, Montenegro. But I want to talk about Ukraine in particular. I've been there. I've met with the workers. I've met with workers who were one day teaching, or were one day doing in the bakery, or they were, and then they were on the front line. And there's 1.2 million of them today on the front line. Many of them physical injuries, but for sure, you don't do months on a front line and come back the person that you left easily. Yeah. So that people are going to need a lot of support. And this gives me an opportunity to mention another reason I'm in Dublin today, which we have a meeting over in my own union, Forza. We're bringing unions from around Europe to discuss the role of trade unions and the role of the workplace in building peace and in helping people who are in post-conflict situations, and looking at the peace economy and how to have a positive understanding of what you need to put in place to have a peace economy. So to say that the discussion's opening now with Ukraine, and it's absolutely essential that the social chapter has the same attention and emphasis and determination as all the other chapters.
Very appropriate point on which to end, I think. I was reminded, I was listening in on the reportage from Tony Connolly today about the chapter's opening, and the report reminded me that there are Ukrainians who are literally dying for what we're talking about, for the social chapter, the EU's values, as you're trying to discuss today. But way over time, but that's indicative of how brilliant a conversation we had. Thanks for being here. You can stay for tea and coffee if anyone has the time, but you can just thank the panelists, please.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.